barely surviving, but the price of bread for consumers has not fallen. For 3 years now, the price of products in supermarkets has continued to rise since COVID, and while our selling prices have collapsed. And on top of that, our purchase prices, for example, for plant protection products, are rising at the same time. We are really suffering from a contraction in our margins.
Anger spills onto the streets of France. Farmers are taking their protests straight to the state, with cow blood and manure dumped outside government buildings. Highways blocked, cities disrupted. This is a direct challenge to President Macron's government. So, why are French farmers on the warpath? And how did a rural revolt bring France to a standstill?
France thought influence in Africa was permanent. It wasn't. Quietly, African countries rewrote contracts, tightened rules, and chose partners based on value, not history. French companies didn't get pushed out. They got outcompeted, and Europe felt the shock as supply chains tightened and leverage disappeared. This isn't a protest, it's a power shift. Africa isn't asking for a seat at Europe's table anymore. It's building its own, and Europe is realizing far too late that it still needs an invitation. The warning signs were there, scattered across trade data, diplomatic briefings, and economic forecasts, but they were easy to dismiss. France had long believed it understood Africa better than most of Europe. History, language, currency ties, and military presence created an illusion of permanence. Influence felt inherited, embedded, secure. What France did not anticipate was how quickly Africa was changing the terms of engagement and how forcefully those changes would reverberate across Europe. Africa's rise did not begin as a rebellion against Europe. It began as a recalculation. Across the continent, governments started asking the same question from different angles. Why growth continued without transformation? Raw materials left, finished goods returned, jobs remained scarce, vulnerability persisted. The conclusion was increasingly shared growth without control was not progress. France was deeply exposed to this realization. For decades, French companies occupied strategic positions in energy, transport, telecommunications, agriculture, and finance across Africa. These positions relied not only on contracts but on systems designed when African bargaining power was limited. As African economies matured, that imbalance became harder to justify internally. Policy shifts followed. African countries revised mining codes, energy frameworks, and infrastructure agreements. Local content rules expanded, ownership structures were renegotiated, revenue-sharing mechanisms tightened. None of this was framed as anti-French. It was framed as pro-sovereignty. France felt the pressure through margins first. Projects became less profitable, negotiations took longer, regulatory certainty weakened as old assumptions no longer applied. French firms accustomed to preferential access found themselves competing openly with companies from Asia, the Middle East, and within Africa itself. The competition was not only about price. It was about alignment. New partners offered infrastructure tied to production, technology transfer, and workforce development. African governments increasingly favored proposals that integrated domestic capacity rather than extracted value. France struggled to adapt its approach. Its engagement model relied heavily on legacy relationships and institutional familiarity. But Africa's new generation of policymakers prioritized outcomes over history. Contracts were evaluated on contribution, not connection. The shift accelerated through coordination. African regional blocs strengthened economic integration. Trade within Africa expanded. Standards harmonized. Cross-border infrastructure reduced dependence. On European routing, this diminished France's traditional role as a gateway. Europe as a whole began to feel the impact. France's economic ties had often served as Europe's anchor on the continent. As those ties loosened, Europe's access weakened collectively. Supply chains tightened, energy arrangements faced renegotiation, strategic minerals became bargaining chips rather than commodities. France underestimated the speed of this transition. It assumed Africa's rise would be gradual, fragmented, and negotiable. Instead, Africa's strategy proved deliberate and cumulative. Each policy adjustment reinforced the next. Each success emboldened further reform. Domestic African confidence grew. Economic resilience improved, fiscal capacity strengthened, political legitimacy followed. Governments that delivered tangible gains faced less internal resistance to continued reform. France's influence eroded not through expulsion, but through irrelevance in key decisions. Meetings still occurred, summits were still held. But outcomes increasingly reflected African priorities rather than French preferences. Influence shifted from presence to performance. The shock for France lay in recognition. For the first time in decades, Africa was not responding to European agendas. Europe was reacting to African decisions. This inversion unsettled policymakers, accustomed to setting terms. France's strategic assets became vulnerabilities. Military presence invited scrutiny. Currency arrangements sparked debate. Trade imbalances faced political challenge. What had once been stabilizing factors were now questioned as constraints. Africa's rise intersected with Europe's fragility. Economic stagnation, demographic pressures, and energy insecurity left Europe less adaptable. Africa's assertiveness collided with Europe's need, amplifying the impact. France could no longer act unilaterally. African governments coordinated responses, reducing the effectiveness of bilateral pressure. Europe's internal divisions further weakened its position. France found itself negotiating not with individual states, but with aligned interests. This was the moment France did not see coming. Africa's rise was not symbolic, it was structural. It affected trade flows, investment patterns, energy security, and political influence simultaneously. Europe faced consequences beyond economics. Diplomatic leverage declined, policy influence waned, narratives shifted. Africa was no longer portrayed as a partner needing guidance, but as an actor demanding respect. France remained engaged, but engagement no longer guaranteed leadership. The first phase of Africa's rise delivered a clear message. The old balance was gone. Europe could adapt, negotiate, and collaborate, but it could no longer assume. And as France began to understand this reality, it became clear that the impact would not stop at its borders. Africa's rise was about to hit Europe hard, not as a shockwave, but as a sustained force reshaping the foundations of a relationship long taken for granted. Once Africa's recalibration matured into practice, France and the wider European bloc began experiencing effects that could no longer be dismissed as temporary friction. What had started as renegotiations and policy adjustments hardened into new operating realities. France's economic exposure became clearer sector by sector. Energy contracts faced stricter local participation requirements. Infrastructure concessions were revised to favor shared ownership. Agricultural supply chains encountered export conditions tied to domestic food security. Each adjustment was reasonable in isolation. Together, they rewired the relationship. French firms discovered that familiarity no longer translated into advantage. Where history once smoothed negotiations, performance now determined outcomes. African regulators demanded measurable impact, jobs created, skills transferred, value retained. Proposals heavy on financing but light on integration lost ground to competitors offering deeper local embedding. Europe felt this through supply strain. Critical inputs slowed, costs rose, planning cycles shortened as uncertainty increased. Africa's internal coordination meant decisions made in one capital echoed across regions. Fragmentation, once Europe's leverage point, diminished. France's diplomatic tools weakened accordingly. Appeals to partnership carried less weight when African growth trajectories no longer depended on European approval. Political pressure risked backlash, incentives required concessions. The balance of persuasion shifted, Africa's rise accelerated through confidence. Successful renegotiations validated reformist approaches. Governments sought tangible gains, higher revenues, stronger domestic industries, improved bargaining positions. Public support followed. The political cost of asserting sovereignty declined. France underestimated this feedback loop. It assumed resistance would emerge once pressure mounted. Instead, alignment strengthened. African countries shared strategies, coordinated positions, and learned from each other's outcomes. Policy diffusion moved faster than European adjustment. Europe's internal contradictions deepened. While France sought to preserve influence, other European states pursued access independently, sometimes undercutting collective leverage. Africa exploited this divergence not through manipulation, but through selective engagement. Partners willing to align gained traction. Others waited. France's traditional pillars faced scrutiny. Currency arrangements were debated openly. Military presence became conditional. Development frameworks were reassessed. What had once been Stabilizing foundations now required justification. This scrutiny did not signal hostility, it signaled maturity. Africa's rise reframed the relationship from paternalistic stability to negotiated interdependence. France struggled with the transition not because it lacked capacity, but because it was slow to abandon inherited assumptions. Europe's vulnerability amplified the impact. Energy insecurity, demographic aging, and industrial transition left Europe less resilient to external shifts. Africa's assertiveness collided with Europe's need, intensifying pressure. Africa did not exploit desperation. It leveraged relevance by controlling resources, markets, and growth potential. Africa shaped outcomes without confrontation. Europe adapted because it had to, not because it was forced. France's influence transformed. It became situational rather than structural, effective in some domains, limited in others, dependent on cooperation rather than default authority. The realization spread across European institutions. Africa was no longer a theater of policy. It was a source of policy direction. European strategies began incorporating African priorities as constraints rather than variables. This marked a deeper shift. Global influence was no longer measured by footprint alone. It depended on alignment with partners capable of saying no. Africa had become one of those partners. France faced a choice: re-engage through genuine partnership or accept diminished relevance. The former required patience, humility, and investment in African capacity beyond extraction. The latter promised familiarity but offered shrinking returns. Africa's rise continued regardless. Trade flows diversified, investment patterns shifted, diplomatic alignments broadened. Europe adjusted unevenly, with France learning that leadership could no longer be assumed. The impact reached beyond economics. Narratives changed. Africa was discussed as a peer shaping outcomes rather than a space reacting to them. That shift altered how policies were conceived and justified. France did not lose Africa. It lost exclusivity, and in a multipolar world, exclusivity had been its greatest asset. Africa's rise did not strike Europe like a sudden blow. It pressed steadily, reshaping structures, expectations, and power relations. By the time the weight was fully felt, resistance was no longer an option. Adaptation was. The second phase confirmed what the first had signaled. Africa's rise was not a moment. It was a trajectory, and Europe, France included, would feel its force not once, but continuously until the relationship itself evolved. Africa was no longer knocking. It had already stepped inside the room.